For more, let's bring in Olivia Gazis. She is the intelligence and national security reporter for CBS News. Olivia, the United Nations General Assembly is meeting today for an emergency special session. This is something that has not happened for 40 years. So what can you tell us about what's on the agenda for this historic session?
That's right. Well, it's happening at the United States' request, and it's really only a handful of times that it has happened in the UN's history since its founding at the end of the Second World War. There won't be any concrete actions against Russia as a result, but it is and was meant to be a very public, symbolic move against Russia because it's essentially many of the UN's 193 member states, their delegates saying publicly today that Russia's aggression against Ukraine was a flagrant violation of international law. It also was meant to put a spotlight on this ballooning refugee and humanitarian crisis. The UN saying today that as many as 500,000 refugees have already fled Ukraine, and up to 7 million may ultimately leave the country. As we've been reporting here at CBS, many are doing so on foot in frigid temperatures with little access to food or water. And there's also this emerging evidence of violence against civilians, perhaps the use of prohibited weapons, all of which appears to be triggering a war crimes investigation into Russia's actions. And if all of that weren't enough, the U.S. also made some additional waves today by announcing that it was expelling 12 Russian UN diplomats who it said were operating on U.S. soil as intelligence officers in manners that were adverse to U.S. security. And so, of course, it was a very historic and eventful day, especially at the U.S.
Meantime, Ukrainian President Zelensky today asked the European Union to expedite his country's application for membership. Olivia, what's behind that move and how realistically is this being considered?
Sure. So it's being seriously considered, but it's not at all clear that this is going to happen with any kind of speed. President Zelensky did officially sign an application to join the European Union today, and he said he wanted to be on equal footing with the rest of Europe. He's already had a warm reception from the head of the EU Commission, who said, yes, absolutely, Ukraine is one of us. We want you as part of the bloc. But it's far from clear what any sort of fast-track solution might be possible. EU accession is normally a highly technical, drawn-out, legalistic process. It involves extensive economic integration, legal and political reform. There's something like 31 negotiating chapters that the Ukrainians would have to go through that range from agriculture to technological issues to judicial issues before it could qualify as a member. And even though they're enjoying a lot of support from European nations right now, it's far from clear that their membership would get the approval from all member states, unanimity. That's far from guaranteed. So this is probably mostly a rhetorical expression of support for Europe and by Europe, which further tweaks the Russians, but it's unlikely to become a reality in the immediate term.
Olivia, also today, a delegation led by Ukraine's defense minister held ceasefire talks with Russian officials in Belarus. But Russia had earlier said that they wouldn't meet unless Ukraine laid down arms. So how did we get here? And did anything significant come out of that meeting?
Right. So we don't have formal readouts from the talks just yet, but we know that they were relatively inconclusive, in part because, as you said, the Russians went in with this set of pretty inflexible maximalist demands of the Ukrainians, who for their part said, we're not agreeing to any preconditions as part of these talks. They were lower level delegations, but the sides ultimately found something to agree on, to agree to a second round of talks. It is very hard to see how they even get that far, given that the talks themselves were overshadowed today by what looked like really intensifying violence against Ukrainian cities, specifically in Kharkiv, where dozens, if not more, civilians are thought to have been killed by Russian weapons. And of course, there's a massive Russian convoy making steady progress in its advance towards Kyiv. That's why the U.S., among others, has said that these talks, as being proposed by the Russians, are really more of a pretense than anything else. They're supporting the Ukrainians in terms of wanting to continue the dialogue, but they're saying that coercive diplomacy at the barrel of a gun is not a conducive condition for successful diplomacy.
And Olivia, in addition to those Russian military moves that you outlined, Russian President Putin ordered his country's nuclear deterrence forces on high alert. What exactly does that mean, and what's the West's response?
Sure. So first, I would point out that a lot of Russia watchers expected President Putin to use this kind of rhetoric at some point. He's made allusions to using nuclear weapons already once before, and it's somewhat even more predictable now that it's going so poorly for the Russians militarily in Ukraine, and he's getting so pummeled by the West's countermeasures that he would want to reintroduce some fear about Russia's capabilities. His announcement, essentially puts, as you said, Russia's forces on high alert. So one step closer to actually deploying weapons. But what experts are now going to be keenly on the lookout for is, physical manifestations that is actually happening. So, are weapons actually being brought out onto the open or loaded onto any kind of delivery mechanism? The West, including the U.S., has treated it as escalatory rhetoric, but hasn't done anything to match the Russians' moves in general. The Pentagon said today that it was completely satisfied with the deterrent posture that it currently has. And when CBS News asked President Biden if Americans need to be afraid about the prospect of nuclear war, he gave a very simple declarative answer, which was no.
Yes, that was from our very own chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cortez. Olivia Gazis, as always, thank you so much for your reporting and your insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.